14 billion before Christ, 13 billion before Christ, 12 billion before Christ, 11 billion before Christ, 10 billion before Christ, 9 billion before Christ, 8 billion before Christ, 7 billion before Christ, 6 billion before Christ, 5 billion before Christ, 4 billion before Christ, 3 billion before Christ, 2 billion before Christ, 1 billion before Christ, 999 million before Christ, 900 million before Christ, 800 million before Christ, 700 million before Christ, 600 million before Christ, 500 million before Christ, 400 million before Christ, 300 million before Christ, 200 million before Christ, 900 million before Christ, 90 million before Christ, 80 million before Christ, 70 million before Christ, 60 million before Christ, 50 million before Christ, 40 million before Christ, 30 million before Christ, 20 million before Christ, 19 million before Christ, 18 million before Christ, 17 million before Christ, 16 million before Christ, 15 million before Christ, 14 million before Christ, 13 million before Christ, 12 million before Christ, 11 million before Christ, 10 million before Christ, 9 million before Christ, 8 million before Christ, 7 million before Christ, 6 million before Christ, 5 million before Christ, 4 million before Christ, 3 million before Christ, 2 million before Christ, 1 million before Christ, 900,000 before Christ, 800,000 before Christ, 700,000 before Christ, 600,000 before Christ, 500,000 before Christ, 400,000 before Christ, 300,000 before Christ, 200,000 before Christ, 100,000 before Christ, 97,104 before Christ, 97,000 before Christ, 90,000 before Christ, 80,000 before Christ, 70,000 before Christ, 60,000 before Christ, 50,000 before Christ, 45,000 before Christ, 40,000 before Christ, 35,000 before Christ, 30,000 before Christ, 25,000 before Christ, 20,000 before Christ, 19,000 before Christ, 18,000 before Christ, 17,000 before Christ, 16,000 before Christ, 15,000 before Christ, 14,000 before Christ, 13,000 before Christ, 12,000 before Christ, 11,000 before Christ, 10,000 before Christ, 9,000 before Christ, 8,000 before Christ, 7,000 before Christ, 6,666 before Christ, 6,006 before Christ, 6,000 before Christ, 5,000 before Christ, 4,004 before Christ, 4,000 before Christ, 3,000 before Christ, 2,024 before Christ, 2,000 before Christ, 1,900 before Christ, 1,800 before Christ, 1,758 before Christ, 1,700 before Christ, 1,600 before Christ, 1,500 before Christ, 1,400 before Christ, 1,300 before Christ, 1,200 before Christ, 1,111 before Christ, 1,100 before Christ, 1,010 before Christ, 1,001 before Christ, 1,000 before, 999 before, 990 before Christ, 900 before Christ, 888 before Christ, 800 before Christ, 700 before Christ, 677 before Christ, 666 before Christ, 606 before Christ, 600 before, 500 before Christ, 404 before Christ, 400 before Christ, 333 before Christ, 300 before Christ, 250 before Christ, 200 before Christ, 199 before Christ, 190 before Christ, 180 before Christ, 170 before Christ, 166 before Christ, 160 before Christ, 154 before Christ, 150 before Christ, 149 before Christ, 144 before Christ, 140 before Christ, 132 before Christ, 130 before Christ, 128 before Christ, 124 before Christ, 121 before Christ, 120 before Christ, 119 before Christ, 118 before Christ, 117 before Christ, 116 before Christ, 115 before Christ, 114 before Christ, 113 before Christ, 112 before 111 before Christ, 110 before Christ, 109 before Christ, 108 before Christ, 107 before Christ, 106 before Christ, 105 before 105 before Christ, 104 before Christ, 103 before Christ, 102 before Christ, 101 before Christ, 100 before Christ. Subscribe to our videos.